Like, we have a ticking time bomb in this emerging generation of progressive illiberalism. And when they become the average voter, a lot of the freedoms that we take for granted, speech freedoms in particular, I think are going to be in danger. I think we got to get a hold of, this is, I think, an emergency issue in terms of education. We got to get the critical race and gender indoctrination out of the school system. We got to get DEI out. This is, I think, at emergency level. So I think this has got to be a very high priority. Now,
we have just gone through a period where we were denied the most fundamental freedoms of citizens in supposedly free democratic states. We incurred grotesque levels of damage to our economies. Our school children are still suffering from a lack of education. And we fixate on bullshit, frankly, about whether J.K. Rowling is allowed to say that trans women are not actual genuine women, when we all can tell that it's patently obvious that they're not, you know. And anybody you want to go and talk to, but they do not use other pronouns. They use he and she because that is patently obvious that there are only two genders.
I just thought, like, if the press were honest about more stuff, like they've self-destructed their own reputation, and in that vacuum, people will try to find something else. Do you run a business of any kind? Do you want 25% off up to 20 taxi rides? Well, if you sign up to Bolt Business with my promo code, that's exactly what you'll get. You don't have to use all 20 rides, and you can use it for your own business rides or for your employees. It couldn't be simpler. Follow the link in the description and use the code BB25OFF20 to get 25% off 20 taxi rides today. That's BB25OFF20. So the reason that I wanted to, speak to yourself and Jeffrey as well, we're going to find some sort of crossover here, as it seems to have worked out. But the main thing that crosses over that I want to talk to both of you about was the US election. I thought it would be fun to start with. There was an article that you wrote about 3-4 months ago, maybe, where you were talking about this stat that 1/3 of Democrats thought that Trump, or hoped that Trump had been killed when he got shot. And I was stunned at this because, like, I'm not the guy's biggest fan, right? But I think it's unbelievable to me that large a portion of the population are that actively hostile to, like, the other candidate. And people have been talking about how we're, like, post woke and, like, we're past, like, the peak of it. And, like, you've touched on that a bit as well already when we've been setting up here. Like, it seems to me like we might be post woke, but, like, we're still becoming increasingly polarized. Like, do you think that's something that's going to continue, or do you think there might be some sort of, like, coming back to the center in some senses?
Yeah. Well, I think we are going to be continuing to be polarized. And the US is already hyper-polarized, right? But I think this will spread. It's already partially spread elsewhere, but I think it will spread even more elsewhere. And the reason is if you think about that 1/3 of Democrats who wish that the gunman had missed, the other thing I found in that survey was that the strongest predictor of that is people who agreed with statements white Republicans are racist. So what I think this all comes down to is the reason that it intersects with woke is that on the left, you've had the sacralization, making sacred of race, as well as gender and sexuality. And so if somebody disagrees with your views, they're not just mistaken or have the wrong idea about society. They've actually profaned the sacred. They violated taboos. And of course, we know that, in fact, the attitudes of most Republicans, the vast majority of Republicans aren't racist in their attitudes. And in fact, when Democrats are asked what they think Republican attitudes are on race, they get it completely wrong because they have a caricature. But so the point I'm making is that these people are actually adherents of a religion. what John McWhorter calls the religion of anti-racism. And that's one of the reasons we see things like race hoaxes. Racism hoaxes like Justice Small. An example of this is such a sort of powerful symbol and totem. And so the idea that if you were to say, let's build a wall on the southern border, or let's deport people, or, Black Lives Matter is done, cause the crime spike, any of these things are deemed in a way that you have introduced the sacred, and therefore you need to be excommunicated. And that's why there's this violent, hostile reaction to Republicans. And in fact, if you do, if you do surveys, you can do them here in Britain too. If you're a Democrat, would you date a Republican? Would you work for a Republican? Would you unfriend a relative if they had different political views? It's always several times stronger on the left side than on the right side. And here would be Brexit Remain. And that's because it's all connected to this making sacred of particularly race. So like, Brexiteer, you must be a racist and sexist and a homophobe. And that's why you're so evil, and that's why you must be killed, right? So I think that's where this all comes from. Until we get over that woke religion, I don't see the polarization going away because, people, these are just irreconcilable value differences.
Like you wrote, we've talked since 14, 15 years ago about how religion might like reemerge in secular societies. And I think we're like seeing that a bit with, there seems to be like a resurgence of Christianity in the West. There seems to be, there's a growth of Islam in the West generally just because of, migration patterns. And then we've got this, woke religion. And then there's a whole bunch of people that, say Jordan Peterson is claiming are actually really they're Christians. They just don't realize it.
Like Jordan Peterson himself.
Well, it's hard to tell with him because I think it's one of those things that I principally just doesn't want to say it now because he spent so long being like, I act as if God exists. That was always his answer to, and I was just like, just tell us what you think, but I kind of respect his desire to remain like semi-neutral on the issue so that he doesn't get like pigeonholed by people. But I mean, he already is. So I don't see the risk for him, if I'm honest. But do you think that what we're seeing is people regressing to like a religious, base in a sense in every facet of this? Are people looking for like a higher power or message or something to like give them meaning in a chaotic world?
Yeah, it's such a big question, and there's so much to it, right? So I think people are always looking for meaning. You could certainly say, though, that woke it has the notion of sacred and profane. It doesn't have the connection to the other world and to cosmogony. So it does, in a way, it's satisfying some aspects, but not others. I'm not as convinced that the decline of religion is the driver of woke, actually. And the reason I say that is, with survey data, I'm sort of a number crunching survey guy, that people who are, if you're a Democrat, and it doesn't matter how often you go to church or if you think if you're very religious, you're still going to be woke. Now, if you're a Christian, there's a greater chance you'll be Republican. But really what makes you not woke is being patriotic and Republican. It's not being religious. So I'm not sure that religion per se is. I think what we have is kind of succession of these secular religions since we've had socialism and there's nationalism and there's a bunch of other ones. This happens to be the latest version. I don't think that that's the reason that we're seeing the resurgence. I mean, yes, the U.S. decline of religion in the U.S. has accelerated. That's true, but religion was pretty weak in Europe, for example, and we've seen places. We've seen woke take off in those situations. Now, in terms of the kind of issue of religion coming back, where we're in London now, where this is actually a religious hotspot of the UK. Why? Well, because it's a hotspot for immigration, and immigration brings religion in. And so that's why London is very religious, particularly North London, where we really happen to be. But that's kind of a good metaphor, because this is kind of the one part of the country religion hasn't declined, whereas elsewhere it's declined very sharply. And the lesson there is demography, like global demography, because the birth rates are really low in the developed world, East Asia, Europe, and its offshoots. Whereas almost like 97% of the world's population growth is in that tropical belt we call the global south, where 95% of people are religious, at least have a religion. They are coming over through immigration and bringing religion into these secular societies. But what that's telling us is actually demography is a counter force to secularization. So secularism reduces religion, demographic shifts increase religion. Long term, I'm saying I think those demographic shifts are going to be more powerful. And if you look at, a good case of study I looked at in my book, Child of Religious Earth, is Israel, where your large ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, there were a few percentage of the population
pretend not to be Zionist,
who are, well, there's a mix, right? But what I would say is that the start of the state of Israel, they were like a few percentage points of the first graders in the Jewish school system. They're now like a third or more and growing. They have 3 times the birth rate. And when you have 3 times the birth rate and you retain the children in the fold, that is tremendous growth over generations. So by the mid-century, they will be the majority of observant Jews in the United States and Britain. And by the end of the century, they're going to be pushing to a majority in Israel. And of course, the whole of Israeli society has shifted to the conservative religious. And because of demography, just by the way, the rise of the religious right in America was 3/4 demographic because they had a 1-child birth rate advantage over 70 years. I did a paper on this.
So do you think that the increase or the decrease in the birth rate is like completely associated, or well, directly correlated with the loss of religion basically in society? And like, Jeffrey, you can maybe speak to this a bit, because we've got in Northern Ireland, we have it's the highest percentage of people who would consider themselves to be religious in the United Kingdom, like by country.
It's declining.
Yeah, declining, but we still have the highest. But we still have the highest birth rate, like replacement rate. Like, do you think there's a correlation there?
No, I don't really, because obviously young people have less inclination towards formalized religion. I think religion is increasingly a kind of vestigial structure. There is a sort of cultural association with certain religious groupings. And this is the case in point is the United States, where the rise of Christian Zionists in America has been the big and notable issue and campaigning group, largely because of the endorsement of certain billionaires. And I think the outcome of the U.S. election, you and I were chatting about this before the podcast started. The outcome of the election was heavily influenced by the podcast bros, the Joe Rogan interviewing Trump, etc.
But there was a lot of podcasts actually that went. I think though, everyone loves Rogan, but he was on Theo Vaughn. I think Lex Friedman had a few politicians on. There was a lot of them,
huge amount. But of course But Rogan is a case in point, because he does represent that a Christian, increasingly Zionist caucus that dominated the Republican side of the campaign. And that's largely because of the endorsement by Peter Thiel and Musk and some other Epstein cronies associated with the Republican campaign. It is really, and so I think that shows the vestigial structure in that religious groups or groups that are manipulated by religions. And you can't overstate the degree to which the Israeli lobby dominates US politics.
I think there's one rep on the Republican side, and I can't think how many Democrats, but there's only one. There's Thomas Massey, I believe, is the only guy who said no to AIPAC money.
Yeah.
The only guy in the Republican Party, which is crazy.
And the entire front bench team pretty much is ardently, when Rubio was one of the first senior appointments announced. And of course, it went wild on Twitter, that video sequence where he was interviewed about whether he thought there should be a ceasefire. And, he was only being asked if there should be a ceasefire.
Yeah.
And so absolutely not. And the woman who was interviewing him said, but what about all the children who are being killed in Gaza? And he said, well, Hamas is responsible for that.
Yeah.
It was absolutely, but
yeah, I don't understand how support for it's a
but there is a whole. This isn't new, though, right? I mean,
not new at all, and it's bipartisan too.
It is, but also it's worth saying, like the Christian Zionism is also. I mean, the religious right is emerging in the late 70s and 80s. And this issue was big with neoconservatism, for example, the George W. Bush years. So this is, I mean, if we're talking about the overthrow of the Republican establishment, replacement of the Bush dynasty with Trump, that occurs. It doesn't disrupt this particular strand, but what I'd say is this strand goes back to that earlier moral majority, Christian coalition, religious right, politics, which I think is actually less important now.
There's a weird overlap, though, between fundamentalist, religious-oriented activism, which you see in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
For example, if you drive down the Shankill Road, coming up to the 12th of July celebrations, you'll see loads and loads of Israeli flags. The Ulster-Unionist tradition has been increasingly identified with an association with Christian Zionism. A lot of people don't understand. I think if you interview the typical loyalist, they wouldn't understand why it is that they have an affinity with Israel. There's a bit of a lost tribe of Israel argument as well that comes from certain members of the Democratic Unionist Party. So it's weird and atavistic. It doesn't really have anything to do with tribal or religious affiliations any longer, but it does have an impact in terms of campaigning and associations and tribalism. It's not true religion. And I'm not referring to the jeans brand here. It's not true religion. It is simply an artifact from religious associations. And people tend to, I think, go in the direction that they're told to go in by the media. And I think the propaganda campaign, there was the cancel culture thing and the woke element to it, because, of course, that's what the Biden administration represented and Kamala represented. And, when Trump was elected, I tweeted, woke is dead. And it got a huge amount of traction. But not true, by the way. Not true enough. But I do think that woke is a kind of straw man. It was the linchpin upon which the Republicans could build Trump's campaign.
Yeah, well, there was that advert. It was like, I think Trump is for them. Trump is for you and Kamala's for they them. Yeah. I was like, that is genius. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
But that's an important. It's actually quite important, that Ed, and the reason is. So I mean, in my book, I'm sort of talking about woke actually having much longer, a longer heritage, going back to certainly the 60s, right?
Yeah.
And certainly, when I was going to university in what I call the second awakening, when in the late 80s, early 90s, political correctness, Eurocentrism, Afrocentrism, all of this stuff was breaking on in the elite campuses, but it was mainly in the elite campuses. But subsequently, that was the same ideology. It was basically political correctness. You could be more or less canceled, actually. So just one example, 1988, student newspaper at UCLA made fun of affirmative action in the student newspaper. The administration shut down that newspaper. They had 300 speech codes telling you how you were allowed to speak. Universities they were all struck down in the courts. But that was 1991. So I think the idea that this is new, I think, is false, but it's certainly because of social media. It's spread much more broadly, but because it's spread off campus, it's now an election issue. And now we have parties winning because the public is too to want to guess the woke position. It's an open goal. The only reason politicians have not gone there is because they've been scared of being accused of being racist or whatever.
Oh, I don't know. I think it's clearly agenda-driven, and we were talking before the podcast started earlier about this. A lot of the people who are associated with the anti-woke argument are people who you would have expected to embrace arguments related to individual freedom during the period of lockdown. So, and ironically,
really lines up like almost perfectly, like that tribalism.
Yes.
Wait, do you think we just exist in a world because of social media where every wedge issue on the planet can just be divided into these like tribes, basically, with like, I don't know, some people sort of on the fence in the middle, but it feels very much to me like every issue can now be put in these weird boxes.
They can, but the key thing is that there were certain things that we were not allowed to speak about during lockdown. Douglas Murray was allowed to do his podcast and be interviewed by mainstream media and appear on stage with Jordan Peterson. And we had sort of, neoconservative nationalist conferences in London towards the end of lockdown and so on, all of which sort of campaigned against woke and new liberalism. But if you were, for example, saying, actually, I think it's wrong that NHS workers should be mandated to get a COVID vaccine, because that is a fundamental tenet of freedom and liberty, you weren't allowed on the mainstream media to make that point. Douglas Murray never made that point. The new right, the new anti-woke right, made no statements about freedom and liberty during lockdown. And of course, Trump himself oversaw the biggest increase in national debt as a result of lockdown and all of the strictures associated with the COVID debacle. And yet nothing could be said about that. The FT the other day published an article indicating that certain members of the Trump team and certain people who were vying to be the Treasury Secretary were proposing that national debts in the United States increased by $15 trillion over the 4 years of Trump's tenure. That was quickly scrubbed from the FT article.
Wait, hang on. This as in 15 trillion added
to the existing 36 trillion.
So they want 15 trillion more. That's what they're proposing over the next.
This, despite the fact that they had created Doge.
Yeah.
You know, so they're creating Doge in order to strip waste out of US government. But of course, most spending in America on government is spent with subcontractors. And those subcontractors are typically owned by people like Peter Thiel or Elon Musk. So yes, they want efficiencies. Yes, they want to reduce public sector workers, but they certainly don't want spend reduced on grotesquely wasteful government service contracts.
Yeah.
But you're not allowed to refer to that. The narrative we have to focus on is the end of woke and the fact that the Trump administration represents the new thing. But actually it doesn't. It represents all of the same vested interests and increasingly has been overrun by corporatism.
You were going to jump in there.
Well, yeah, I obviously had a different view, and not that I question any of the financials there, but I do think this woke thing is a much bigger threat and it is a bigger challenge to our civilization. And I, with all the absolutely right on these questions of freedom, but we are now in a situation where the young generation, Gen Z, if you look at survey data, I'll take a couple of questions. One is whether James Damore, the Google programmer, should have been fired by Google. Again, we're talking about a free speech issue. 2/3 of them say he should have been fired, right? Really? Yeah. And another question, should J.K. Rowling be dropped by her publisher? They divide 50-50, whereas anyone over 50 is like a couple of percentage points. So we've got, you take large-scale student surveys, we'll find typically that 7 out of 10 students think that if the professor says something that students find offensive, they should be reported to the administration. Like, we have a ticking time bomb in this emerging generation of progressive illiberalism. And when they become the average voter, a lot of the freedoms that we take for granted, speech freedoms in particular, I think are going to be in danger. I think we got to get a hold of, this is, I think, an emergency issue. We need, in terms of education, we got to get the critical race and gender indoctrination out of the school system. We got to get DEI out. This is, I think, at emergency level. So I think this has got to be a very high priority. Now, the other thing is, of course, it means if we can't have open discussions because of woke taboos, you can't deport people, that's racist. You can't arrest people, that's racist because of incarceration and there's more black people in jail. So we're going to have crime waves and we're going to have uncontrolled borders. And all of these things are downstream of woke. So it is, in my view, the number one.
That is the public square. That is the public square that is being defined for us. And I'll give you an example of this. During lockdown, I was in London here, and a good friend of mine, a school teacher, a guy called Hugh McCarthy, a retired head teacher, was on the BBC saying that he felt that masks were interfering with children's education.
Mm.
The wearing of masks by teachers in the classroom meant that particularly students who were perhaps had learning difficulties or problems with hearing, we're being dragged back in their education. And that was the simple point he was making. I am a retired head teacher. Mm. I have an issue with teachers and students wearing masks in the classroom. For that misdemeanor, for suggesting that might be the case, somebody professionally qualified, eminently sensible, an advisor to the Department of Education in Northern Ireland, for suggesting that might be the case, he was taken off air. I then was and somebody contacted me. I was here in London. It was on BBC Radio Ulster in Northern Ireland. And I was so incensed that I contacted you when I got back home, and I said, listen, come over to my house and we'll record an interview. And I'll put it up on YouTube. At the time, the BBC was part of the Trusted News Initiative. And at that point, when I put the video up of Hugh McCarthy saying all the things that he wanted to say on air, but wasn't able to, YouTube pulled it after 800 views, right? Because obviously somebody at the BBC had contacted them and said, this is disgraceful. This shouldn't be allowed out. This is terrible.
Well, they were just very ban heavy. I'm not sure how I managed to not get, honestly, the people I had in this show. No, I've somehow managed to, but I got one strike once, but that's never been removed. But that was it.
But the difference, Josh, was that it was related to him being removed from air from the BBC. I, as an active citizen, thought that he should be given airtime, and I published it on YouTube. And within hours, it was taken down. I would say almost certainly as a result of overtures made by the BBC. At that time, by the way, X and all of the other social media platforms and the news organizations like Reuters were also part of the Trusted News Initiative. In other words, the public square is defined. And yes, you can say all you want, and you can attack woke like Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson and the rest of them. And you could have a huge platform on social media if you attack woke or promulgate woke ideas. But God forbid that you should say that children and teachers shouldn't wear masks in the classroom, because that was an agenda item that was defined by the establishment, and you could not challenge it. And that means that we, for a period and a continuing period, I would suggest, have lost some of the most fundamental tenets of freedom of speech. And Elon Musk is not going to resurrect freedom of speech for us, because he owns that public square.
Yeah.
And he will decide who will achieve millions of followers on the public square.
Yeah.
And if you challenge the conventions, if you challenge Elon Musk's or Peter Thiel's narrative, you will not achieve that platform. And you can certainly achieve it if the only thing you fixate on is woke.
Yeah.
We have just gone through a period where we were denied the most fundamental freedoms of citizens in supposedly free democratic states. We incurred grotesque levels of damage to our economies. Our school children are still suffering from a lack of education. And we fixate on bullshit, frankly, about whether J.K. Rowling is allowed to say that trans women are not actual genuine women, when we all can tell that it's patently obvious that they're not, And anybody you want to go and talk to, they do not use other pronouns. They use he and she, because that is patently obvious that there are only two genders. Yeah. This is a straw man pile of nonsense that has been propagated by captured media.
I think, but you're both speaking to you're weirdly both speaking to a similar idea, in that there's been a loss, there's been an increase in a progressive illiberalism. I love that term. That's great. I'm going to keep that. I'll cite you.
I did have even the economists talk about the establishment use that term about persists. Okay, I can't claim it to be my own.
Okay, but like, I think the issue is that there's certain topics on all social media platforms now that can't be assessed, and I wondered, because a lot of it like does relate to like what you can say that like lines up with the woke agenda, and I think you're 100% right that there was like things that we just couldn't say for a while online. But it's a little better now that X is in like the hands of someone with a different ideology, but it's still not ideal in that like a couple of people have control over like what they can say.
No, it's no different at all when it comes to COVID.
Just some difference between blue sky and it's yeah, like you can't go on blue sky and type there are two genders. You're gone. But like
I accept that on X, but of course not now. Of course, the liberal left are all defecting from X about that.
That won't last. There's no
The mainstream media narrative has not changed at all. Even this morning, the FT wrote an article about.
I don't know. I think they're slowing.
Let me make this one point.
Okay.
There was an article in the FT this morning about RFK's team. You know, he's got Del Bigtree and all sorts of like podcast bros now on his team.
Okay.
But the article made clear that anybody who on the team, like Del Bigtree, was a conspiracy theorist.
Oh, yeah.
You know, but that still is the narrative. You will not hear to this day anything on the BBC relating to, for example, vaccine efficacy or whether the vaccine was safe and effective.
But they're never going to I think they'll never retread those paths. It's disgusting, but they will never retread the paths that they've already got, like, because they've hammered them so hard. But I wanted to ask whether, because like, yeah, we're all talking about this idea that there's like things that we can't say, that the increase in like illiberalism in Gen Z is like a concerning issue for anyone who wants to be able to speak freely in society about, you know, just what they believe to be true, like sort of short of like actually inciting violence or like calling for people to be, you know, attacked or something. But I wondered if you think that this will stop when they collide with reality. Because like, for example, I saw a video yesterday of a girl who'd had her phone stolen by two homeless guys in America. I don't know where it was or if it was staged, but I think it speaks to the point, you know, you can never tell with these things. But she was basically just being like, yeah, but like, I'm a good person, you know, please, like, just, you can steal from a rich person, but, you know, please just give me my phone back. I'm a good person. And I was like, are we reaching a point where like the consequences of the policies that people have openly backed because it's the right thing to do, quote unquote, will collide with, the people who've been pushing them, and that they'll maybe think, oh, actually, there was like, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Like, do you think that because they always say that, you know, the older you get, the more conservative you get. Like, is that likely to happen in your mind? Like, will they change their mind? Because I've changed my opinion since I was 19. Like, I'd find myself insufferable if I talked to 19-year-old Joe. I mean, I was always still willing to like talk to people who I disagreed with, always, but no, I've changed my opinion on a lot of stuff as I've, you know, been in the world and encountered like what the world is like. It just happens. Like, do you not see that happening with the next generation?
Yeah, I kind of do. There's two parts to this. The first is getting mugged by reality, right? And so I think Trump's election, actually, you look at the reaction this time to the election in 2016. It's actually a little bit different. I remember I was talking to somebody who worked at Slate, which is a sort of prominent left-wing magazine, yet he was sort of the least woke of Slate writers. There weren't many non-woke ones, but he said, what we need is actually Trump to win again for them to change. And it didn't happen. So they thought, okay, 2016, look, he lost the popular vote. It was one-off. Done. We've won. The fact that they lost, and they lost convincingly now, means they really have to start to rethink. So you talk about the consequences. So again, it's not just about woke as culture war and a battle over ideas. If woke means you can't deport illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
if woke means you can't put people in jail because of defund the police and decarceration and these sorts of narratives, then you're going to have skyrocketing crime. You're going to have out of control illegal immigration. You're going to have falling educational status. You can't get rid of poorly behaving pupils if they happen to be more likely from one race or another. So now what you've seen is a revolt, and the revolt's actually happening in the heart of the bluest of blue cities, the New Yorks, the Los Angeleses, all of the working class who tend to be non-white in these cities. That's where the biggest shift to Trump has been. It's been Hispanic, black males, Asians in the New Yorks and Los Angeles and other of these cities have moved. They've gotten rid of these progressive district attorneys in places like San Francisco. So there's been a revolt. It's the excesses, the defecation on the streets, the crime everywhere, the illegal immigration. And so I think that stuff, that disorder is the downstream effect of these limitations on debate. So I actually think this is going to prompt, a bit of a rethink. Young people, what I'd say there is we do have some indications now. In the UK, the last 18 months, we've seen a 20-point shift in the under 25s on gender issues, on immigration. What's happened is the apolitical middle, more of those apolitical Gen Zs have shifted towards what you might call conservative positions. I think what that's setting us up for is we think we're polarized now. In 20 years, I think we're going to be hyper-polarized around these cultural issues because you've got a very woke, and that's going to be slightly gendered. So generally, women are going to be more likely to be woke.
I've written like that quite a lot about like the difference.
There's this big growing gender gap. I don't know about growing, but there's a large gender gap amongst younger people that doesn't exist amongst older people on a lot of these issues.
Why do you think that is?
Because generally, I think women tend to back what are the prestige established community norms, conformity to those established conventions. They've been taught in school by elites and all the institutions that woke values are the most important values and you must stick with them. Young boys are more nonconformist. They've rebelled against this to a greater extent. And so what we're seeing is this very big divide. I mean, the gap in Canada and US and Europe, or certainly in Britain, questions around political correctness, you see like a 40-point gap between young men and young women. So if you run that clock forward, now, of course, there's a whole question mark, and I'm not dating, I'm not on dating apps, but, one of the issues is with such a woke and progressive women and increasingly right-leaning young men, what's that going to mean for dating when
it's going to mean it means guys are going to lie.
Exactly. But is that going to affect marriage and family formation? And I don't know is the question, but I think this gender gap and it's mapping onto this sort of growing polarization in the young population. I think that's one to watch, but I do think a chunk of those young people, because they're not watching mainstream media, they're getting, they're tuning into podcasts, they are drifting away from woke, but a chunk of them have been indoctrinated and are going to be, and that is going to be a huge divide, I think, going forward.
Mm. What do you think? Do you think people are going to change when they collide with reality? Or is this going to continue?
I think there's a more rather than look at what's happening in terms of the demographics vis-a-vis attitudes to woke. I think there's a more fundamental issue at play here. And you can see it more particularly in the United Kingdom because the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are essentially the same political party.
Yeah.
There was no discernible difference between Conservative Party policy and the Labour Party policy.
No.
They're both defined by the same things. Highly globalist.
Mm-hmm.
They're certainly not either conservative nor socialist. They present a sort of party mishmash of nonsense, which is very, very establishment focused. A case in point, last week, Keir Starmer announced that he was entering into a strategic investment partnership with BlackRock. And Larry Fink is Trump's personal portfolio advisor.
Yeah, he's been touted as possible possible Treasury Secretary candidate as well, hasn't it? Really?
Well, no, the Treasury Secretary has been appointed, and there was So it was a guy called Scott Bessent, who's a hedge fund manager.
Okay.
His hedge fund, interestingly, was funded by George Soros. Elon Musk has been very public in terms of the fact that he can't stand, apparently, George Soros or his son.
It's just a team club, isn't it?
Yeah. You're not in it.
Yeah.
And so, but think is a case in point. Yet clearly, there is no real discernible difference between BlackRock and the Fed any longer. BlackRock is the Fed, is the US establishment. And of course, he doesn't care what governments or what flavor of governments are in power. Now, to put things in perspective, BlackRock has over $11 trillion under management.
Yeah.
BlackRock
It's a wild number. What's the GDP of the United Kingdom? It's like, 2 trillion or something so it's 5 times the GDP.
In respect, it's only very recently that Apple announced that it had exceeded $1 trillion valuation in terms of its market cap. There's no companies that come anywhere close to this. This is the amount of money that they have under management.
People talk about Bezos and Musk and stuff having an enormous amount of power, but they own like a couple of companies and they're worth a couple $100 billion. And that's like 20 times the size. And it's like one guy in charge of it. Well, it's obviously like not, but
it's just in terms of cash management, very short treasury bills. He's got hundreds of billions of dollars under management. And that's money that comes essentially from US national debt. That is US national debt. So that one asset management firm is managing hundreds of millions of treasury debt. The US government is investing into ETFs being run by a private company. That private company is advising the president on his personal portfolio. He's also advising the administration in the United Kingdom. This coincides with the fact that they're going to change the inheritance tax rules, which will mean that lots and lots of family-owned farms are suddenly going to be in the market. Who's going to be buying them? Well, probably the first 2 visitors to Downing Street after Keir Starmer was elected, namely BlackRock. And the Bill Gates fund.
Really, it's really worrying but they've done the exact same thing in the United States. Like they bought up all the not all the farmland, but like BlackRock and Bill Gates have been buying up like huge swathes of farmland. It suggests that they would consider food security to be something that's going to become like increasingly important because the world's like a lot more unstable. We get food shocks with like look at Ukraine, like through fertilizer prices through the roof. Like a third of the world's grain comes from Ukraine. And then now the loans for financing some of the war, one of the clauses in the contract, this is wild, right? Is that after the war, as part of the payback for the loans, BlackRock, Vanguard, and I think it's State Street get like hectares and hectares of Ukrainian farmland. It's
potentially
fingers in as well. Fingers in so many pies, and it's worrying that like that it's the exact same people that seem to have more control over our government or more influence with our government than any public opinion.
And that's why I say again that this public square debate around quite frankly ridiculously trivial issues. Well, a few exceptions, but in fact, there aren't even any exceptions. There are gender dysphoria. Typically, they're going to have one set of chromosomes or the other. So the fact is, it is something which is patently ridiculous, anti-scientific bullshit. There is no other way to describe it. But yet, our public realm, our public debate, the 2 political parties dominant in the United States are arguing, bickering about this. But of course, there's another straw man being set up. It's now that Trump is in office, and potentially Nigel Farage in office, come the next general election in the United Kingdom. No, it's no longer going to be about the woke debate versus Trumpism. It's going to be about digital identity, because Trump is saying that, he can't put up with the fact that there's so many illegal immigrants coming across the border. Farage is ranting on about the fact that we're getting, 900,000.
Yeah, that's rough, dude.
Those are illegal immigrants. We don't know how many illegal immigrants that come into the UK. So the big focus of debate and discussion within the political parties is going to be around immigration. And that was the case. That's why Farage wasn't allowed anywhere near the Vote Leave campaign, because the Vote Leave campaign was pretty purist.
They also just absolutely hated him. Like, hated him. They hated him. They just so hate him.
And I worked with Vote Leave, and Matthew Wells,
because he was set to steal all their voters.
It was fundamentally for those of us who were motivated by other things other than immigration, or saying, "Look, there's a Muslim over there." It was about UK sovereignty, about national sovereignty, about a nation being able to govern itself, and that debate is going to be lost because it's now all about digital ID. It's all about Peter Thiel's agenda. It's all about Palantir owning the NHS. It's all about organizations like 38 Degrees putting up petitions in order to do personal identity harvesting because they're funded by the same organizations. It is like Soros. Soros funds Big Brother Watch. Big Brother Watch is supposed to be all about the
really? Yep. So many Carlos, Big Brother Watch.
Yes.
Really? I have to look that up. But would you feel that it's more important in the at least, because I think those are all very key issues to challenge the society, mainly because it means that the people who have the most influence over policy are not the people of each individual country anymore. It's the big fundamentals.
It's pure play corporatism.
But you think...
I say I was a former capitalist.
Yeah.
Corporatist. It is... We have corporations running both... United Kingdom is the 51st state. We do what the Americans do. Sterling is pegged to the dollar. If the American interest rates goes up, the UK interest rate has to go up. We can't get out of parity with the dollar. We are essentially conjoined with the US system. It was clear, Rishi Sunak was one of the biggest investors in Moderna, for example. His hedge fund made, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars from the Moderna IPO. The Moderna IPO was funded, to all intents and purposes, by Operation Warp Speed. This is pure. They're running amok. They're taking us for fools. And while they're spending all of the taxpayers' money, they're not spending the taxpayers' money. They're spending debt.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're ranting about woke.
But I think that Eric does have a very good...
And there you go. Provocation. Look at things differently. I mean, it's not that I think those issues are important. I think you've always had corporate influence in government, and it's always a problem. You've got to look.
I don't know. It's not doubting that it's also important to have the voice of business represented in government, because it does provide employment for a lot of people. So you can't just you can't just be we don't need the businesses, because you kind of do in a sense. You
don't want crony capital, and I think Jeffrey's right. I mean, there is this issue of crony capitalism and political business lobbying, and that's one of the main reasons you had such an enormous spike in immigration in all the Western countries is for that reason. So I'm totally agreeing there. I think, however, this I think this is civilizational. I maybe have a different view because I've been in academia and I've seen the pressures. I've been, had multiple internal investigations and Twitter mobbings, and I've seen how people essentially just suppress their views. I think that in our cultural space, that's media, that's education, which I think is the key to schooling, the degree of indoctrination, the degree to which, you can't have an opinion if it violates that of the woke elite who control the unions. This monster just got out of control, and it's affecting the reason you take the trans issue. You're absolutely wrong. Very few trans people. The issue, however, is if we abandon the idea of a truth-based order, that you cannot speak the truth as you believe it. the trans is one arm of this. It's only one prong of it. And I think the race thing is a bigger part of the problem. In Canada, where I'm from, a good example is there's a set of myths that have grown around these things called residential schools, which were schools that Indigenous children were sent to simply because everybody was said that you have to go to a school. Now, they could go to their local school. There weren't enough of them because they're very remote. Only a third of Native kids went to these schools. Actually, their survival rates were better at these schools than they were on reserves. Mm-hmm. There are a whole set of these myths, including this idea that somehow there are 215 children buried in a mass grave next to these schools. And then all of a sudden, these other claims came up. It's all bullshit. There was never a parent looking for a dead kid in school. There were no bodies found in any of these graveyards. It is a complete woke myth, but it is a woke myth that has been endorsed by the main political parties, by the mainstream media. No one has got the guts. A few people, a small number of dissidents have got the guts to call it out. My point there is simply that you can have an entire society that is denying reality because of the pressure of this making sacred of race. Making sacred of gender is another example of this. What this is all about is being super sensitive is more important than telling the truth and being able to pursue truth. And the problem with that is it cuts down free speech. It's completely counter to the Enlightenment. This whole agenda of Indigenous, the land's been stolen. It's hit the Indigenous weren't stewing the land up each other. It's been used to undermine countries like Australia, like New Zealand, like Canada, and the US. It's being used. They're now trying to elevate Indigenous knowledge to the same standard as science, right? They're trying to essentially undermine this idea of objective truth. The problem is this is an assault on objective truth and an assault in the name of hypersensitivity to so-called emotional traumas and microaggression. I think this is enormous. I think they are trying to year zero the history of countries so that they can remake it, so that they can claim that, in Henry VIII's time, you had a multicultural society, a multiracial. That way they can manipulate the past, as Orwell says, and then they can tell you anything. They teach you anything in school. So I guess I would see this as really foundational. And that if we don't protect the truth-based order, that's why the transition. It's not necessarily because, it is partly because of kids getting the breast cut off, but it's also because of this assault on truth and then pushing us towards this Orwellian society.
I absolutely agree with you on all of the points you've made there. But I do think that the agenda is being defined by an establishment media, which is at least waning in influence. There's no question that the BBC just produces a tissue of nonsense these days, particularly in terms of news and current.
But I think that's almost the entire developed world has got to this point where people just and I was having this discussion with someone the other day actually because they were tweeting about that this is relevant and related. So they were tweeting about reform and being like because they just hit 100,000 members in the United Kingdom, right? And I asked them why they think reform has garnered so much success. Like, what is it about the rest of the parties that is driving people towards reform? And their response was, it's all conspiracy theories. It's them being crazy. It's like the right-wing media. Like, I don't agree with any of these like assessments, right? But that was basically their argument. I just thought, like, if the press were honest about more stuff, like they've self-destructed their own reputation, and in that vacuum, people will try to find something else. Like, do you think that?
No, I would disagree with you. I think reform has been engineered to capture that. Or someone was bound to stay at it. Remember that Farage only sort of entered a return to be leader of the Reform Party at the last minute, just weeks before the general election was called. People were saying, well, he doesn't have a long enough run. He did pretty well, in terms of the increase in the vote for reform. Richard Tice, total waste of space. He wouldn't have got anywhere close.
Yeah, well, Farage is a big part. He's the most popular politician in Britain. Yeah. He's won. This is the best bit. He's won Journalist of the Year twice.
Yes.
No, seriously. He's voted for by the public, and he's won twice, 2 years in a row, because of his show on TV News.
Yeah, but the there's a key thing in terms of the show on GB News. He's bankrolled, of course, by Sir Paul Marshall, who's the majority owner of GB News, who also owns a huge hedge fund. Sir Paul Marshall used to work for BlackRock. He's paid substantially more as a GB News presenter than he is as a parliamentary.
Which is disgusting. I don't think they should be allowed to have another job.
Absolutely. But the agenda is pretty much being defined by his owners. Farage is a puppet. He's a very, very competent media performer. And whatever is presented out there will be defined by syndicate. The fact is that reform represents an opportunity, again, a corporate opportunity. I've had a bit of a disagreement. Like Majid Nawaz and I had a bit of a Twitter public spat on this issue because ironically, Majid was quite supportive of reform and actually believes definitively that Nigel Farage will be Prime Minister after the next general election in the United States.
There's a fair chance.
The other thing is, of course, the manipulation of the recent petition calling for a new general election.
Yeah.
Elon Musk was routinely retweeting that, complete with a photograph of Nigel Farage in the tweets. Now, at one point it was getting 90 dollars.
So much about the United Kingdom's
Exactly. Just my final point. The Farage, of course, was schmoozing around Mar-a-Lago immediately after Trump was elected.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. With Larry Fink and the rest of them all there. So clearly, Farage is part of this new corporatist syndicate that is going to redefine the right.
You could say that he was introduced in Trump's first election campaigns. He was like Mr. Brexit. And, I think Trump loved the fact that he could bring out this what sounds like a very well-spoken British person, to the Americans, we signed incredibly intelligent. I say we, but but I think he enjoyed that. So I'm always slightly skeptical of saying, okay, well, they're all at the same dinner, so they're all working together because, I feel like they could be having arguments at that dinner, they could have just been invited and Farage thinks, oh, well, I'll go and, bake myself up and raise my profile. I always think you can't just draw that correlation that says, they're at dinner, so they were definitely working together. Zuckerberg went to Mar-a-Lago. It's of course he went to Mar-a-Lago. He's talking to the new most powerful man on the planet. They're all.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. I mean, I think that it's not possible necessarily just because they're, Marshall might have been a blank. I mean, it could be, right? I mean, I think that case needs to be proven, but I wouldn't ipso facto think they've got an agenda to say, because, I, for example,
believe me, you've always got an agenda. If you run a hedge fund, you've got an agenda and you've got portfolio.
Yeah. My apologies. All right. What were you going to say there before? You were going to jump in on something.
Well, then I was just going to make a quip about whether does Musk actually do his Twitter account or does he have someone running it? But anyway, that's
Well, 24/7. It literally is 24/7.
Isn't just, but maybe it is just sitting there constantly. But how do you run other stuff? How do you run for a company?
I don't know. He must be a machine, but no.
Probably a machine. Yeah.
So yeah, no. I mean, I think these are all interesting ideas. I mean, I think this question of control, right? I mean, I guess I'm more a believer in ideas as kind of viruses that get spread by individuals peer to peer. And if you catch the woke virus, then, so it's more of a kind of COVID model where I don't necessarily think it's all driven by, say, financial interests. I mean, I think you could see that in a number of ways. So if we take support for woke or support for even the populist right or it's got very little correlation with how much income you weigh.
But I don't think Smith, if that's true, explain J.D. Vance.
What about him?
He came from nowhere. He's obviously Peter Thiel's acolyte.
He was quite famous amongst liberal journalists in 2015-16 for writing his book Ideology. They fawned over him. They were they had him on every podcast, on every show, and they were like, "Oh my God, we should have read your book, and then we would have understood Trumpism." And they were just sitting there praising the guy. And then he comes out as Trump's VP, and all of a sudden he was this weird, crazy guy. And I was like, "But you were saying he's a genius 8 years ago."
Right. But I think so, for example, I think it would be in the interest of big business, for example, to get public opinion to support mass migration. Like if I were to say, if you were a hedge fund owner or a very rich person, that is definitely in your interest. I cannot. So, for example, it is very difficult for me to understand the shift against immigration or the politics of immigration restriction from a self-interested hedge fund perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that in other...
Does you own Palantir?
Yeah, I mean, it may be that in other issues, but so I'm sort of... there is self-interest, but I'm sort of more of the view that this kind of religious viral spread of these ideas. So, for example, woke, there's been indoctrination. There's been spread through social media, through Tumblr, and through other things. And I do believe in these cultural currents. And I think what's happening is the elite opinion has long been out of step with public opinion on a whole range of subjects, but especially anything around immigration, anything around, culture. And so what we're seeing, what I would explain this backlash that's occurring, the rise in populist right since starting in 2014 with the European elections, is really about the mass of the public which have been ignored on its cultural preferences, sort of backlashing against the elites who have been very much globalist. They've been very much in favor of mass migration, very much in favor of the woke agenda. And I think that's now blowing up. And so now there's always going to be a populist elite, like a Farage figure who will. But Farage has been on the wrong side of certain things. He has not necessarily caught the mood every time. But I think they can sense where the public mood is. And so I would say Farage is created by basically frustration in the population about mass migration, just the same way Le Pen and Trump wouldn't have got anywhere without the immigration issues. So these are sort of popular frustrations that the elite was trying to ignore. So the elite really would love mass migration. That's their financial interest, but they can't ignore it when. And so politicians like Trump, they say,
I'm curious as to what's actually going to happen, right? And I think he probably will go ahead with trying to deport people. But like what has happened, for example, in the United Kingdom for the past 14 years has been the winning party has always said, we're going to reduce migration every single time without fail. And they didn't, so it's very easy for us to say like, now, okay, Farage could come in and go, right, close the border, no more visas. Like you could go super extreme or want to go super extreme, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the result of like.
Well, let me just quickly say on that, because you had the Blair government and wasn't really. I mean, yes, they were making noise about asylum seekers, but they never actually said they were really going to bring immigration down. Then you had the Tories come in right under Cameron, and the Tories did manage to get immigration down a little bit. But then after 2015, it starts to surge again. I actually, however, think that the fact that the Tories didn't deliver on immigration is what has given UKIP its rise. So people believed the Tories initially because this was all about Brexit, right? So the Brexit movement was kind of the backlash to Cameroon high immigration. People said, okay, we got Brexit, we're getting immigration down. Now, what happens is Bojo takes over the Brexit politics, gets all those Brexit voters in. What does he do? Jacks up immigration. So the Brexit voters are now like, screw you. So I do think there is a degree to which the voters are watching what the party does. And when the party fails them, they get disillusioned and go elsewhere. So I think if Farage goes in and doesn't do anything about immigration, then people are going to desert Farage. So I do think there is this, and I do think eventually there will be discipline in the system. And eventually somebody is going to be able to bring them up.
The only caveat I would apply, though, is that Farage has been making a big song and dance about UK's membership of the ECHR. And in fact, one of the Conservative Party candidates responding to this for the leadership, I couldn't remember who it was, but he was arguing that not only should we leave the ECHR, we should also scrap the UK Human Rights Act, which essentially goes Robert Jenrick.
Yeah.
And so therefore that's now the Overton window, essentially, within which we're allowed to discuss the whole immigration issue. Should the UK Human Rights Act be? Now, the UK was one of the first signatories of the European Convention on Human Rights after the Second World War. It kind of emerged from Nuremberg. These are the most fundamental rights that you should not, as a citizen of any nation, be persecuted. Now, of course, Farage is now spinning that to say, oh, it's because we're not allowed the act of deporting somebody who's entered the United Kingdom illegally infringes the UK.
Is that true? Because I've long thought that this seems to be like a mistake. Yeah, like nonsense. Because Keir Starmer's deporting more people than the Tories ever did at the minute without leaving the ECHR.
Yeah. No, on that point, I was jumping up and down over the last few months about the proposed enactment of the Northern Ireland Public Health Bill. And Northern Ireland is further ahead, we can put it like that, than other regions of the United Kingdom in terms of putting in place legislation that is being demanded by the new public health agency for the United Kingdom, the UKHSA. The S, by the way, stands for Security.
Health.
It's the agency, yes. So essentially, this is a surveillance operation. They're in the instant when they define that there's an instance of public health threat, and they can pretty much define what it is, and they can immediately create a state of emergency. Suddenly, that legislation will kick in, which essentially will mean that your rights under the UK Human Rights Act will be suspended. The Northern Ireland proposed bill will allow them to vigilantes, essentially appointed by the Public Health Agency, to come and knock your door down, drag you out of the house by the hair, which they did during COVID lockdown, and forcibly inject you if they choose, because mandatory vaccinations are included in the bill.
Yeah.
Now this
worrying bit of legislation.
Yeah, horrific legislation. Yeah, this will be enacted across the United Kingdom. It's already been done in Scotland. They plan to do it across the United Kingdom. It's pretty much been mandated by the UKHSA.
Canada have their own version of it, actually.
They know there's a lot of problem.
In the Canadian one, they can, if they can seize your property if they deem it to be necessary during an emergency. But
yeah. Well, I mean, the problem, of course, a lot of these problems in the Canadian one as well, which I know better, is that the courts. The question is not just the law; it's the judges and whether they are activists. And so, in Canada, you've got a left-wing catcher judiciary. So they will say, if the College of Psychiatrists wants to debar Jordan Peters from practicing because he said some, a woman's an adult human female or whatever he wrote on in Twitter, they can do that. So they are essentially they're saying that these bodies, which are unelected, woke-captured bodies, people must be deferential towards. Whereas, if Trudeau wants to freeze Turker's bank accounts, he can do that. This is because the judiciary has been captured, and they're basically doing the bidding of the Liberal Party because they are. But this is the problem, right? So if it's the European Convention on Human Rights, the Human Rights Act, you get a judiciary that is taking a kind of globalist interpretation and interprets the law in that way, then the law is a problem. Now, the actual correct solution is to somehow replace or to get better judges or to vet the judge. And one of my worries about Britain, at least in the U.S. has the Federalist Society, which can wash over who gets appointed to various levels of the judiciary. Canada, the government has some power to appoint on the Supreme Court. My worry in Britain is if it's just judges appointing themselves, these things are just going to drift in that one direction. And so I'm wondering whether this will eventually be a problem in Britain. It is the judiciary. Who makes up the judiciary? They're coming out of the law schools. Over time, they're going to drift woke. Somehow, somebody's going to have to get hold. Now, I know there's parliamentary sovereignty, but it's still tricky to break to buy up.
The only thing is that it has to be said that the lefty woke were traditionally, supposedly, the protectors of human rights.
Yeah. That's the weird bit about it, is that we've ended up in a place where, and this, I think, is what we're all worried about, is that any of these wedge issues will be used to reduce the amount of freedom, rights, and liberty that any of us have in our developed Western democracies. That's the bit that worries me about any of these issues, is that the problem of the judiciary as well is that if you come in, it doesn't matter the size of your electoral mandate, right? Trump gets elected on a 60-70% of the vote, or Farage comes in with 50% of the vote next time and stonking majority in the United Kingdom. As soon as you then go, okay, I'm going to clear out a branch of government, right? That's going to be a check against, the the parliament or the federal government in America. That is unbelievably concerning from anyone who like has looked at history and goes, well, when have we ever seen judicial purges basically that aren't led by someone who then becomes a dictator? So that's that's worrying for me as well. Because as much as you can say, yeah, okay, well, what we need is someone to come in and clear out the cobwebs and the people who are ideologically captured. But then you get to a point where you have to put your faith in this new person to like make the correct decisions and not just the ones that are benefiting them and the administration that they're in.
Well, just a couple. So that you're putting your finger on what's some pretty key points, right? So one is, yes, you need a judiciary. You need checks and balances in the system. So I'm not in favor of clearing out judiciaries. What I am, however, if the judiciary is reproducing a set of values which are contrary to that of the majority population, you need to have a way of translating the preferences of the majority of the population into the selection of judges. A good example would be in some of these Eastern European countries when the communist regime had appointed all the judges and that's overthrown. Do you just leave those judges in there? So there has to be some feedback from the democracy into the judges so they don't make their own laws. So I do think U.S. system's criticized. I actually think it could be improved, but I think in some ways it's better that you have democratic input into the judiciary. The other thing I would say is that I don't believe in this idea that the bureaucracy as a check on the executive. I think the bureaucracy largely should do the bidding of whoever gets elected. And if you don't like that, you just elect somebody else. The courts are a different matter. They protect individual rights. But I don't believe this idea of the bureaucracy is a check on power. Sorry. They should be just doing the bidding of whoever's in power, subject to the law, but they don't get to be making their own policy. Sorry. They should be obeying whoever is in power.
Case in point, though, Fauci was pretty much, he did his own thing, didn't he? He was obviously given carte blanche to do that by the establishment. But
like Trump, to be fair, and he would
absolutely. So it's clear that you are right. Hannah Arendt referred to the banality of the evil emerging from the bureaucracy. But in case in the UK civil servants, in UK civil service, which obviously career civil servants, less political civil servants, as per the US federal government, but they pretty much do their own thing.
Now, did they? They resisted implementing Brexit, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. Which seems crazy, but the cheap purveyors of woke.
Well, if you're attacking woke, the first place to look is, like the four proposed. I don't know if anyone has been appointed yet, but the four proposed cabinet secretaries, worked merrily through the last Conservative administrations, and again, I worked as a consultant at the Department for International Trade, and the senior leadership of that department were on speed, in terms of woke arrays, shared gender, bathrooms and all sorts of stuff, and everybody in senior positions was appointed on their ideological position vis-a-vis woke.
Yeah. Well, that's the ESG scores are doing that. And then they enact the legislation that makes it like required for corporations to, like, the people talk about the NHS and I think it was like a 70 grand a year diversity like officer for like individual trusts. But that's like mandated in UK law that at a certain size of corporation you have to have that. So it's not even the NHS making that per decision. It's like actually in law that you have to do.
Well, there's a combination. I think the 2010 Equality Act is a huge problem, and then that needs to be removed or pruned back. But the other thing is, of course, that, so universities, for example, they'll all overinterpret. They'll say, because of the Equality Act, we can't let you question whether trans women are women. And the reason that we're drumming you out of the university is the Equality Act. Well, it's not actually. The Equality Act doesn't say that. So you have the woke institutions going beyond the letter of the law. They will resist, however, like when the Supreme Court of the U.S. now says you can't do racial preferences in student admissions, they'll resist tooth and nail. When they want to get rid of DEI in Texas, the universities will resist tooth and nail because they don't believe in the law, right? So you kind of these institutions are a problem, but the law can also be a problem, both potential problems.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap up because we're fast running out of time in this room. But it's been a very interesting discussion, guys. Thanks very much for your time. Really enjoyed hearing the two different perspectives on how screwed we are.
Yeah, but I think the summary is we're screwed.
Okay, do I take off?
Well, I mean, I still think humanity is not fully doomed.
No, it's not, but it's down to the individual, isn't it? Ultimately, it's down to every individual deciding for themselves how they should run their lives. Don't let the guys get us down. It's
true. Well, I think we can all agree on that. But is there, before we wrap, is there anything you guys want to plug, like new podcasts, books, things?
Well, I've got a 15-week open online course on woke, which at the University of Buckingham. So do check that out. And then my new book, which is called Taboo. So that's out. That's me.
Wonderful. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I blog at the newera.uk. I don't think you need the www anymore, but the newera.uk. So lots of interviews and opinion pieces and articles about a lot of the stuff I've been discussing, and me pontificating about my views on the latest U.S. Treasury Secretary, etc. So,
well, as long as they get a Bitcoin strategic reserve, I'll be a happy man. Should be fingers crossed, guys. Be nice house deposit on the way. But yeah, thanks very much, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Josh.
Hey, listeners, real quick. Do you ever find yourself sitting watching the stock market like this? Well, now you could instead be ordering my book like this. It's the story of GameStop. You can purchase it with a hoodie, with acknowledgements, or just with the early backers edition. It's all about the GameStop story. It's the real story, not just what you've seen on films. It's exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years. And with DFE back, I'm finally able to draw a conclusion to my book. Please pre-order it. It really helps me out. And you will get it eventually, I promise. Hopefully this year.